All units stand 3. It now appears as though shots are being fired. All officers use caution. It has been confirmed. Suspects are armed and are firing at police.
60 on the air. Northwest Sequel, Signal 10. Building fire. Headquarters, Northwest Sequel Fire Department, 1000 North Broadway, towards North Park Drive in North Albany.
Multiple explosions coming from 661. Unable to get any ambulance, any reach out except for 667. Automatically go to a third alarm.
Welcome to Scanner School. My name is Phil Lichtenberger, and thanks to my dad, I have been into the scanner radio hobby since about the time that I could walk. You see, my dad, my grandfather, and even my uncle has always had a scanner radio in their homes, and their love and their knowledge of scanning was passed down to me. And my goal here on the podcast is to take my love and my knowledge for scanning and pass that along to you. So if you're new to the hobby or you're a seasoned user, I want to welcome you back to Scanner School. If you have any questions that you need help with, we are here to answer them. You can find plenty of help over on our Discord server by requesting one-on-one tutoring or by even submitting your questions for our monthly Q&A session. And we'll put links to all of those in the description of today's podcast. I've got a question for you. Have you ever heard of a thesis on scanner radios? That's what today's podcast is all about. And our guest today, Brian Rackham, is working on his thesis all about scanner radios. Brian's been in the scanner radio hobby for years and has used his knowledge of scanning throughout his career. While working in the media or while introducing the next generation of scanner radio users as a teacher and an educator, Brian brings a lot of knowledge and experience into the scanner radio world. Today's conversation is two parts. The first part, I'll ask Brian about why he's writing a thesis on scanner radios, how it's going for him, and what he plans to do with his thesis. A little bit about his background and where he's going with this. In part 2, Brian is going to ask me the questions that he asked everybody else as part of his thesis. And it's basically, he allowed us to record that process and play it back for you. So if you'd like to reach out to Brian and be part of his thesis, you can look down again at the description of this podcast episode. We'll put links there. But keep in mind that his thesis, he's writing it now, but at some point he's going to have to close down any more contributions to it because, this podcast will live on a little bit longer than the window is before Brian has to close down and actually put what he's been bringing in and put it down to paper. But again, the links will be down there below. So with that, let's go ahead and join this conversation that Brian and I recorded.
Brian, this is a interesting and different perspective on everything here. Very much a first for me. Before we get to start too far along here, please introduce yourself and let everybody know what we are here to talk about today.
Well, my name's Brian Rackham, and I am, first of all, a veteran journalist and now an academic. And I worked on the assignment desk in a couple of places, including in Denver, and became a scanner listener myself. But I am a researcher now, finishing my doctoral dissertation at Arizona State University. And it's about people who listen to scanners. It's about the content that groups of scanner listeners sometimes share with both themselves and sometimes with the public, and how that relates to journalism and how scanner groups often cooperate and work with journalists and how all that works. And that's what my dissertation's about. And it's turning out the more people I interview and the more research I do, the more fascinating it is. I also teach journalism at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff.
Very interesting. So you, excuse me if you mentioned prior, but you are a current scanner radio listener right now?
I do listen on occasion,
Yeah,
absolutely.
on occasion. Okay.
And we have one in our student newsroom.
Very
That's
nice.
always going. And I have a couple of friends who run incident notification services, which is a big part also of my research.
Excellent. And how long have you been working on this entire research project for?
Oh, probably about 7 years. And
Really?
I'm in the home stretch. doing, I don't have to do a lot of interviews, but I have to do very selective ones and a lot of background research.
So when you say home stretch, you say about the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I mean, how
About
much
the next
further do you have?
6 months to 8 months,
Yeah.
I think I should be done. Yeah.
Okay. So that brings you and I together here too. So you put it.
Yeah.
Well, explain how you and I came to talk about this.
Fortunately, the folks who run Radio Reference let me put a little notice up on their forums saying, hey, if you're interested in talking about scanner listening, I'm doing some research. And you contacted me from there and offered to assist. And so after we talk, I'm going to interview you. So
Yep.
I'm delighted to be on your podcast too. It's great to know that there is one about scanners.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to have you here and also to be able to help you out, because that was part of why I put the podcast together. It was to help people with the scanner radio hobby. So whether they're getting started with it or just have a general interest in it, or are diehard scanner radio listeners, something for everybody. And everybody starts somewhere when it comes to a new hobby. And I think a lot of people who are into something for years on end forget what it's like to start from scratch, especially when it comes to the scanner radio hobby. If you started in the hobby 20 years ago, starting today is much different than starting 40 years ago. And, I mean, we have to go based on 20 years, but it's a lot different. And getting started today can be overwhelming to somebody because there is so much more available to have to navigate through, right? It's a different course. So you getting involved and even bringing it into the students, I mean, that you have, and that you've got a scanner radio right there, and having people hear it as or the students at that age, I think is great, because it gives them a little bit of a taste for what they can listen to and be part of the hobby that way. So kudos to you to not only do research on this one, but also introduce the hobby to new people.
Scanners are really critical, I think, to journalists. They're tip services, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most news organizations don't report straight off the scanner, but they sure do welcome tips from the scanner and from people who listen to scanners and report those tips and share them.
Exactly. Yep. And as we go through your questions that I have outlined here, we're going to find out that is starting to become a little bit more difficult. But there's reasons behind all of that as well. So how many more people are you looking to have conversations with to help you with your research?
Well, this is the kind of study this is what's called qualitative research. So I'm basically doing kind of like a focus group. I'm just talking to a select group of people who I know do what I'm interested in studying. And then I'm going to write in great detail. I'm asking them all sort of the same questions. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to write in great detail about what they say. And also, there'll be a large section about just sort of the history of listening and why people listen and all the details, because there's very little work, if any, academically that's been done that I've been able to find anyway. So it's a fascinating world, and it comes at a time when journalism is in trouble and newspapers are closing and people are looking for ways to get reliable information, including journalists, any way they can. So scanner listeners are one potential resource, obviously, vetted. Nonetheless, I think, that's one of the reasons this is really fascinating. Jack Dorsey, who founded Twitter or co-founded Twitter, has been quoted many times on 60 Minutes even, saying he got the idea for the service because as a kid, he listened to railroad scanners. Really? And he loved the short bursts of traffic. And he thought, this is a great way to deliver information. And sure enough, Twitter turned into what it is today.
That's interesting. I didn't never heard that story before. So that's pretty cool that Twitter actually has its background in there. I know originally it was limited to 140 characters because that was the limitation of cell phone text messaging at the time. So they wanted to at least keep that wrapped into that as the boundary. 140 characters. That was tough.
Well, scanner traffic, especially in the initial times before trunking, you wanted to keep your messages short. because you wanted to make sure other people had a chance to get in if there was urgent traffic.
And that also comes with good radio practicing as well, knowing to wait 2 seconds or 3 seconds to see if somebody else wants to come in before you respond. And if you're into amateur radio, that's definitely something they teach you when you're doing some exercises and drills, especially during emergency communications.
And I actually am. So yeah,
you are.
That's how I got into scanning, was through ham radio.
Excellent. A lot of people go one way or the other. They get into scanning and then into ham radio, or they go vice versa. So it's two hobbies that work really well together, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So let's flip the script here a little bit, unless there's anything else you want to bring up right now before we get started. But I'll pass the baton over to you, and you can start asking me some questions about what you need for your research.
Well, first of all, and these questions are kind of basic, but I like to ask them to the same similar questions to everybody, so I can get answers from different perspectives. My first question is, how did you start listening to scanners, and why do you listen to scanners?
Okay, so I started listening to scanners because I was exposed to them at a very early age. My family, the scanner radio was kind of like the TV. My dad always had one on, so there was one always present in my parents' house, and my grandfather would also listen to a scanner. So if you remember the old days of the BC 101 with the dancing lights going back and forth, that was my very first experience when it came to, well, one of them, right? But that radio, to me, has a memory, has sentimental value, because that was the scanner that was on at my grandparents' house when they were still with us. And I vividly remember that being in the kitchen above where the microwave would eventually be housed, right? But it was on a shelf up there. And they would listen to the local police department and the local fire. And again, the fire at that time was on low band, so you'd actually hear the entire county go out as well. But from where we sat in the living room, because it shared the opposite wall was where the scanner was, and my grandfather's chair at the kitchen table was the head of the table, he kind of sat at the threshold between the kitchen and the living room. So in his chair in the kitchen, he could not only eat, but he could also turn and see the TV. So that scanner radio was always on, and it always filled the house, basically, no matter where you were between those two rooms. Eventually, my uncle would take a scanner and he would move it over next to the couch and on the coffee table. So then it was the opposite corner of the house would also have a scanner going. Eventually, when that BC 101, and my grandparents passed away, he acquired the house and everything else. So scanning was always in that home. And my father, again, was, I think, the catalyst that got everybody really involved. So he was into radios, he was into CBs, he got into amateur radio, and he actually worked at a marina or a marine store down in Freeport, Long Island, where not only did they sell the typical, marine communications and antennas and fishing lines and whatnot, but they also sold scanner radios and they sold crystals. So there was always a scanner radio at my parents' house. My very first hand-me-down scanner was a 6-channel Fanon Slim Scan, which I still have. And in fact, last week I found on eBay somebody was selling a unopened brand new leather case for that radio. So now I could take the disintegrating case and kind of retire that and put it back in a new case and refurbish the radio a little bit. But that was my first true hand-me-down radio. And again, crystal control radio, still in the neighborhood of that BC 101, dancing lights across the screen and the whole deal. But my dad, with his love for it, was passed down to me. So he still has baby food jars in the garage full of crystals. I have boxes of his old equipment that, he's kind of handing down now. So I've got older radios that are showing up at my doorstep, basically, that were his. And again, a lot of these old radios, I remember exactly, vividly, where they were in use, me pushing the buttons and rewriting the memories on his radios and writing them back, when I was done playing with them. So that's really where I found my way into scanning. It was handed down to me, something that my dad enjoyed doing, and it was passed on to me. So
what do you think?
There was a part two. There was a part two to that I forgot to get into. So what was What was the second half of that one?
That is, why do you think you and people in general listen to scanners?
Okay. So why do people listen to scanners? Is it's a hobby, first of all, right? It's something of interest. And there's a ton of things out there that you can listen to. So many people just want to know what's going on in their neighborhood, right? They want to listen to the local police and the local fire. And for many people, that's it. That's scanning. And my father is that way, listens to one fire department and the local county PD before they encrypted. My grandparents were the exact same way, and so is my uncle. And again, that's fine. If that to you defines the hobby and what it is you enjoy about it, then that's what you enjoy hobby. There's plenty of other hobbies out there that a lot of people enjoy a very small part of, and that's what they enjoy, whether it be gardening, a walking club, or even running, right? I mean, there's people who enjoy walking, but there's people who want to do more than walking, and that's the running club, right? And when it comes to scanning, there's a lot of other side hobbies that kind of go hand in hand. If you're into railroads and rail fanning, you find yourself listening to scanners because you enjoy that extra layer of that hobby. If you're into aviation, the same story. You enjoy listening to the planes flying overhead, landing, getting clearance, whatever else, then that's another layer of that hobby that goes in there. You enjoy air shows. You can enjoy listening to the acts, the military flying. But there's plenty of people out there that just want to hear the military planes flying and practicing, and that's great. I enjoy hearing satellites as they pass overhead because it's something different, that they come and they go. The ability to listen to the International Space Station's onboard repeater or to be able to talk to them is, 5-6 minutes within a 90-minute window, basically. And then, that's all you get. It's interesting to be able to hear that. Some people listen because you never know what the next transmission is going to bring. It could be something very exciting, but a lot of it could be just routine. But there's a lot of different things out there for people. I mean, some people listen because they're bored and they want to know what else is out there. If you're out shopping or if you're passing through, well, they have radios on. Oh, can I listen to them? That's another example of why people listen to scanners. And then a lot of people like to do it because it brings a little bit of intel that normally you can't get through other avenues. So what really did happen at that accident scene, or what really did happen, during major news event that just happened, that happened down the street from you. I mean, I've had people on the podcast that, there were some big national events, both tragedy and routine type of stuff that happened in their neighborhood. And they were able to listen to everything unfold in real time through a scanner radio. And it's there is a bit of excitement when it comes to listening to history unfold with your own two ears. Not as exciting as listening to the local house burn down, but again, you still hear all that activity and the traffic and the excitement of the radio user. But there is something that it gives you a little bit of insight as to what is going on. And it's hard to otherwise explain. I mean, it's like, why do you enjoy fishing? It's fun.
Sure.
Well, what's so fun about dangling a line in the water, right? To somebody who doesn't get it, they don't understand that it takes a little bit of research and a little bit of practice, and a little bit of skill. And, the joy of having that line pull for the first time and to bring in and not knowing, is that going to be, your own personal best that you caught? Everybody's hobby is different, but I think it all in the end brings the same dopamine hit, right? That everybody is kind of looking for. So.
Have you ever found or heard from the many people I'm sure you talk with that they hear things on the scanner and then the official version of the story comes out and it's different?
I'm sure that has happened. I don't know exact examples, but I did speak with somebody recently who was monitoring the chaos that happened on January 6th. He was able to listen to a lot of that. So how much of that he heard versus how much was public knowledge after the fact through media outlets, I don't, I'm not there to know one from the other, but I'm sure it happens. I mean, there's even stuff that you hear live over the radio that is later only one side of the story too, because it's just the point of view of the person pressing the microphone. You don't know what else is happening. I'm sure, whether through uncovering what actually happened versus, sit down and take down meetings that come out of it months to years later. How much of it is true? How much of it is not true? I mean, I always try and leave politics at the door when it comes to the radio hobby, because that's just a whole nother can of worms that
I'm with you.
is a fine line that you really don't want to cross when it comes to this hobby.
Now, one of the things that really fascinated about you is I was looking up, and at some point I saw something that you did. You work on scanner history, and scanner history, I've done a lot of work on it, particularly on when scanner listeners started sharing information with each other. What have you learned about scanner history? I mean, obviously that's a lot, but
yeah,
can you share with me a little bit of some of the nuggets that you've learned?
So are you looking for like the technology changes, or?
Well,
stuff
I'm
like
talking
that,
about
or?
the hobby itself, when it started and how it developed and that sort of thing.
So a lot of it started way before my time. So I have to go back and relate to some stories, but it always comes down to really some guy who's very crafty with a little bit of knowledge, and it always goes into that, enough to be dangerous, right? I think is the way to put it. And with radio circuitry being the way it is, to be able to modify something by detuning it, right, to not work into the spec it was defined to work in, but you modify it to work to where you want it to work. And it could be very easily done with very simple radio circuitry, not what we have today, but what we had, maybe 100 years ago when it came to radios, right? And a lot of people who get into the hobby that were, and I don't want to say around 100 years ago, but around the time before you had commercially available dedicated hardware to scanning, would modify radios to be able to monitor police band, because police band was just adjacent to maybe FM radio or AM radio. Well, they sit down and broadcast AM radio, but it was around that area that they could tune into. So whether they had even a TV, I think at that time too, right, was adjacent to some of the public safety band. And by detuning or retuning, they were able to then start picking up other transmissions. And again, too, you could have done that with transverters or something like that, or an additional box that would go in between basically the antenna and the radio itself's tuner would basically detune that frequency that it was being received anyway, so it would be able to be picked up by a normal radio. And those, again, the old days of the tuning dial and the needle that moved back and forth across the dial. And then eventually you started getting into an era where you'd have radios that were then coming out for the hobby, right? Crystal controlled radios that basically you go and you go see the guy behind the counter and you say, I want to listen to the local police department, the local fire department. And that was my dad. That everybody knew to go see my dad at the local shop, and he would know all the crystals that you would need to listen to the local county. And he would give you the crystals, and then you'd pop the crystals into your scanner. Eventually, there were books about scanning that would share these frequencies. There would be, I think, the Betty Bearcat Scanner Master had a set of books too, and Radio Shack would got into it as well with books and sheets and stuff like that. And I think that became the first version of social media with scanning. Like, this is the phone book for scanners. I remember spending hours with my dad's books, copying into my own notebooks. And in fact, I still have probably one of those 2 notebooks here that I would write down all the frequencies. And then you get to the back, and then those were the pages that were mailed to you later that were corrections or additions or whatever else to the book that you had just bought. Because again, once things go to print, it takes a while for it to end up in the, in the bookstore or in the 2A shop or something like that. So that was part of the hobby. And again, at the time, 6 channels, 8 channels, 12 channels. Ooh, you had 12 channels. That was a lot. Then you started getting into the synthesized radios. And that's when things, I think, started to really modernize, because now you could write your own memory channels. And we're skipping over the time of like the BC 101 where you set up the dip switches and you hit program. And then, that was like the first programmable scanner. And there was a couple too that ran off of punch cards and stuff like that. But synthesized, when things were stored on microchips, that's really when you started to be able to control more of it, because then it would open up more than just 12 channels or 20 channels, whatever it was, because you could always manually program in one more that you wanted to on the fly. So conventional, right? FM was where it was out, straight analog signal. And then eventually we started migrating into the trunked era. And everybody thought when trunking came around that it was the end of the hobby. The hobby was dead because we had this new thing called trunking, which basically meant that you had a computer running on a frequency, and the computer would tell all these units as a group where to go, what frequencies to navigate and bounce around to. And scanners at the time, this was brand new. There wasn't anything out there that would allow you to do it. So of course, people got creative and they would just scan through the voice channels. They would never really know who they were listening to, and they couldn't lock out anybody. But eventually scanners caught on. People learned how to program their trunk systems, and new trunk flavors came out and new scanner radios came out. And it was always a cat and mouse game. And then we got into the world of digital. And digital now opens up a whole other layer, right? P25, NXDN, DMR, Tetra. And there's no scanner on the market right now from Uniden or Whistler that does Tetra. But Tetra is big over in Europe. So it leads this like, well, what do you do? And now you start getting into we start navigating now into a brand new world of software-defined radios. And software-defined radios basically is you have a USB stick, you can buy it for $40 or so, or you can spend $400 on it, depending on how much you need out of that unit. But this now allows you to use your computer to not only tune around, but also manipulate things like modulation and setting up different types of splits and scanning and using third-party software to emulate a scanner radio or do some recording. Or you can split that one radio into 3 radios or 4 radios, depending on hardware and processor power and USB bus bandwidth and all these other crazy fun things that you can do. And you can basically go almost, I won't say DC to daylight, but you can get software-defined radios that are unblocked, that are completely open, that can monitor basically anywhere and any form of modulation. And as long as it's not encrypted, because that's the big, we'll talk about that in a little bit, I'm sure. That's really the whole history of scanning in a nutshell. And as far as going, I know this is long answers for you, but getting into the whole idea of history of people and talking about it, like I said, I think the book was the first social media, right? The book was really where it was at. My first experience with a community when it came to scanning was the local amateur radio repeater, where they had a play on words, right? Long Island has the Long Island Sound, and that is the body of water between Long Island and Connecticut. And the name of the net was the Sounds of Long Island, I think was the name of it. I think it was the Sounds of Long Island is what they would call it. But it was all about the frequencies and the scanning that was in use in the tri-state area. So that was my very first experience and participating in the net. And again, I was a teenager or a young teen at the time, and I would sit there, and I wasn't smart enough to have a tape recorder next to me and record the stuff. I would sit there with paper and pen and write everything down as fast as I could and hope I caught it. I mean, it would have been nice if I had recorded them, but there are people out there who have actually archived those nets and have repurposed them and put them onto the internet so that you can go back and listen to those. And I'm sure if I listened to enough of them, I would actually hear myself checking in on that net as, my old amateur call sign. But there's other nets out there that were involved with that as well. There's the NYDXA, which is the New York DX Association, that went on to that. There are, again, groups that would spin off from the amateur radio groups and would become their own groups. There's the Tar Heel, I think, is the one that's down in North Carolina. And there's other groups out there as well that sprung up and became their own little circles, I guess, when it came to the scanner radio world. So yeah, that's a lot of how people would navigate through. Then eventually now you get into the social media aspect of it that we think of today with Facebook and online forums and stuff like that. There's apps like Zello, GroupMe, Discord. I mean, if there's an avenue at this point to have people huddled together into a chat-based platform, you're going to find at least one scanner radio group, I think, somewhere in there.
In those early chats that you were involved in, were they talking mostly about frequencies, or were they talking about what they heard?
It was mostly about frequencies. And again, if it was an unknown frequency, they would talk about who they heard on it, but not so much divulging like, I heard that there was a fire on so-and-so, or, over at least the amateur radio stuff. When it comes to the text-based groups, you would hear a lot more of that. And again, too, I left out a whole chunk there where it was the IRC days too, right? You had the alt dot, rack dot, whatever. I mean, there were scanner radio rooms even going back that far as well. So
old chat rooms,
chat rooms. Yes.
Bulletin boards.
Yes. Yeah. Even the dial-in bulletin boards. Yes. In fact, in the amateur radio days too, we used to have packet radio, and there was a group and you'd follow there was like the chat bulletin board or the basic bulletin board, and you'd look for AMSAT or for sale, and there was always 1-2 for scanning or scanners or something like that. That was part of that. So yeah, like I said, if there's any way of chat medium, I think you're going to find scanners using that. All right, we're going to take a quick break here in the middle of this conversation. As a reminder, anybody who's a Patreon supporter at the $3 or higher level doesn't get this upcoming break. For everybody else, we'll catch you all in just a second.
A big part of my dissertation, too, is focused on this idea of sharing and particularly what they heard. There's a group in Colorado that I worked with when I was an assignment editor at the NBC-owned affiliate there. At the time, it was NBC-owned. Now CBS owns it. But they were called the Mountain News Net.
Okay.
And they would use pagers, and they would have a group of dispatchers. And the dispatchers would take in reports from various members. They have about 500 members in this group, and they would decide what to send out, and they would send it out, and everybody could watch or could look at it and see what's going on where. And they also worked with the media and charged them a little bit more and to be a member, and the media benefited greatly from this, and it still does, as a matter of fact. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with any groups like that, and even those who may have existed before pagers. I don't know.
I'm sure there were some that were around before pagers. I was involved for a while with a group called Breaking News Network that was out of Fort Lee, New Jersey. And again, they use pagers. And in fact, I still have one of the old pagers sitting in a closet over there that I had set up for them. And it was always cool. I mean, it was like, something would happen, the pager would go off, or you go back later in the day and find out what you missed. But same thing as that group that you're talking about in Colorado. It was a lot of news agencies, newspapers, TV stations, even board up companies. And they would all be paid subscribers to that kind of stuff. And people like myself would listen to a scanner, and we would pick up the tip line and dial the 800 number, or we would use the computer app to send them a tip about what we heard. And if you had a reputation of sending out good information, they would just let it go. Like, okay, you can self-dispatch. We know that you're good to go. Or you'd have like 3 or 4 people who all chime in at the same time, and then everybody's little call sign or ID would end up at the end of the page. So again, that was one way of doing social networking. But there's also private radio clubs that were involved, I think, before paging as well. One that comes to mind here, and again, I don't want to just say Breaking News Network was the only one out here. There was a couple of other ones. They all had their own cliques, and everybody would oh, these guys are bad, you got to come over here, or these guys always send out bad information, you should come over here. It's always one of those, my team's better than your team kind of deal. But there were radio clubs that were involved, I think, even before paging. 2 that come to mind was Citywide One New York, out of New York, and also Citywide, which was the other one. Which one was number 1? Which one was number 2? I don't know. But they had the same deal. It was a bunch of guys who would listen to the scanner, and they were approved to come on because they were all members, and they would share what they heard over the radio. And I don't know if this went out to anybody in particular, or what, if they funneled information down a news desk. But instead of me listening to the FDNY or NYPD, I would just leave those 2 frequencies on scan all day long. Because if it was newsworthy, or if it was something big, I would know about it, because somebody else was about to come on the air and say, hey, there's a robbery in downtown Manhattan, or you have a fire alarm structure fire up in the Bronx. So that was a lot easier for me to listen to those kinds of things than it was to listen to everything.
Those were free services, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you had to pay to be a member of them. But to listen, it was free. They didn't encrypt. There was no voice inversion or like that. Then you start getting into more modern radio clubs that are out there, and they use services like, or at least locally here, they're on DMR, or they have their own DMR system. And that allows them to have a bigger footprint. It also allows them to tie into the internet a little bit better and have voice over IP that way. But it gives them the ability now to start encrypting their radio communications so that only their members can hear. But it also allows them to have alternate channels or talk groups on the main system, so they can have a side talk or a back room or whatever it is that you want to call it. And you can have just the media channel where just the breaking news happens. And then you can have the romper room off on the side. So there is that form of community that still happens over the radio. And hey, who's going fishing today, or go outside and look at this, or something that would involve as well. So there is still that form of community that happens.
You mentioned that you kind of had to earn your spot before you could directly page. And the reason I asked that question is that I find a lot of these groups have standards for what goes out over their nets, what goes out over there. I call them news feeds because that's kind of what they are. And what kinds of things did you have to qualify? I mean, what kinds of things did they look for? And they're probably basic things, but I'm curious what the standards were.
So basically the standards were common sense, right? You're not going to put something that's going to put an officer or a first responder in jeopardy, right? That's one of those things that you don't want to have it go out there. They also had like a code that if it was a member of service or something happened to a member of service or something like that, they kind of don't want to be the source of information from that, because you never know who is a subscriber or who is listening or who might be relaying that information. And the kind of the code was that if somebody was injured or was line of duty death or something like that, you'd really want the proper channels to be the notification for that, not somebody who's listening to a scanner who's excited to say, I just heard this happen, right? That's not a good way to find out information about a loved one who might be on duty in that neighborhood at that particular time. So that was one of the things that I think they did not want somebody paging, but it was detailed information. It was like, you didn't want to bombard somebody's pager with 27 updates because of a size up or every single unit that's responding in, or, they're having a low water problem and they got the water district showed up and was able to add some more feed to the water system. So having all the information up front, knowing, right, not to basically jump the gun and just send out the page, but to sit back a little bit, collect some information, verify the address is correct, verify that the size of information is correct. And that kind of information was basically how they understood that you knew what you were talking about. And also too, there was always that one guy that was the gatekeeper, right? There was always somebody on desk or on paid roll. And his job too was also to manage the calls. And if he saw that you were submitting enough information and he was just, yes, that's good. Yes, that's good. Yes, that's good. Eventually they would realize that we don't need to gatekeep you anymore. That your information is spot on. You've got all the details in there. Your text is correct. It's spell checked. It's within the character limit. But again, people also would start to have reputations. This guy's stuff is good. This guy's stuff needs a bit of work. This guy is off the handle. So we'll never let him page. So there was always that kind of, that kind of stuff going on as well.
Gatekeepers, we call them editors in journalism.
Yes.
And you're talking about, well, I'm curious, are there things that just aren't important enough to scan, to share? Was there sort of a magnitude issue there at all? Or
I mean, I think a typical fender bender, wouldn't. But if it was like a road closure or a train derailment, I mean, I think if a cat's stuck in the tree, I mean, it's not newsworthy. It's not pageable. But I don't know if that was the question you were asking.
That's kind of the question I'm asking. I mean, magnitude is what we call a journalistic news value. Mm-hmm. But it seems like there are certain things you just don't share because nobody cares, because they're routine. On the other hand, there might be something that's weird, like 50,000 gallons of molasses spilled on the expressway, which may not be traditional hard news, but is interesting.
Right. Right. And that stuff would have gotten paged out as well. Yeah. Yep.
And accuracy is clearly important.
It is, because not only, it's the reputation of the company that you're paging out for, right? That's really where it comes down to. They want to make sure that they are reliable because they have people out there who are paying for the service. And if your information to them isn't reliable, then, it sends somebody in the wrong direction. They're not going to use your service. So that was always there. But if you look at with today's age, with a lot of the chat groups, you do find a lot of information is sent out and then corrected. And these are fine because it's on groups or chat groups. The house numbers are incorrect. Street name is incorrect. Wrong town or department was issued. And there's always this huge debate as to whether or not it's a working fire or not, because where I'm from, they have a code for working fire. And if someone goes, oh, it's a working fire, it's a house fire, then all of a sudden you get the whole debate. It's not a working fire. They didn't issue a 10. They didn't issue a 1335. They didn't issue a 1075. It's just a regular routine fire. It's not a working fire. I mean, I didn't know that a fire had to be employed in order for it to be, I mean, these are all different things that people start coming out of the woodworks about. And then again, that becomes the fine line as to what something is newsworthy. Well, is it a microwave fire or is it a kitchen fire? And then did it become a working fire? So, these are all things that I don't know, to me always irked me when it came to some of the things. Are there flames present? Do they knock it down with a garden hose? Okay. Could you have roasted a marshmallow over it? I mean, it's like, but again, somebody's coffee pot that melted is not newsworthy. Somebody's bedroom that caught fire, that's a little bit more newsworthy. But if somebody's house caught fire and burnt to the ground in 30 minutes and 5 departments show up, yeah, that's leading news, for the morning type of deal. So
that's fascinating. It has always fascinated me, the similarities between some of these groups and journalists, and the material that they send out is, I mean, could you call these people citizen journalists?
I think you could. I mean, because they are reporting what they hear. And it depends on, I think, how far they're willing to take it. Like if they're going to stay within their own private group and they're going to talk about amongst themselves, are they just buffs or are they journalists, right? I think at some point you cross the line between a radio buff, scanner listener, and somebody who takes action and does something. There are Facebook groups and other groups out there that are public facing that will post what they hear over the scanner. I mean, that might be more of a citizen journalist than just a group of people who are in a chat room talking, because now you're putting it in a public domain. People may be looking, okay, road closure in Pike County, PA, due to, I guess, a molasses spill or whatever it is, right? Road closed for the last 3 hours. Yeah, that's citizen journalism. So is the guy, I think, who picks up the phone and says, hey, news editor, I'm listening to the scanner right now. I have a tip for you. I think the guy who picks up the phone never gets the credit for the tip, but the Facebook group might get sourced on a news article saying, as per whatever mom's group out of so-and-so town. I mean, but there are other people out there too that do that. They just sit by the radio and they just post to Facebook all day long with the play-by-plays, and that's their hobby. That's what they do, whether it's right or wrong. But yeah, I think, and there are other websites that become more polished than others that deal with, more homegrown type of websites that are community focused, that get a lot of their information off of the scanner. They write blog posts and they're not the big paper, but they're the digital version of a community resource of things that happen around town that they may hear over the scanner. So yeah, I think they could be qualified.
I've got some articles I'll have to share with you from the 30s and the 20s of people who were listening to scanners and showed up at events. And they weren't listening to scanners. They were listening to homebrew radios of some kind. Police departments were actually complaining about the number of people showing up at crime scenes. So this is in 1929. So this has been going on for a long time. What do you think, by the way? I mean, there are bad actors in this hobby, are there not? Ones who maybe show up at things they shouldn't show up at and cause trouble? Or
has happened. Has definitely happened. There was an issue where there was somebody who was having either a psychotic episode or whatever, but he was walking around threatening people with knives or whatever it was he had. And people showed up because it's interesting. This is a guy walking around. He barricaded himself in a home, and we want to know what happened next. A lot of people listened to the scanner. A lot of people were on scene. And again, too, lights, if you have 6 cop cars sitting on an intersection, it's going to draw a crowd anyway. The same thing happens with police and fire, right? If a house is on fire, you're going to get people that show up. You're going to get people who are ambulance chasers. They hear the sirens. They're going to go find out where they are. I think even without scanners going on, you're always going to have a crowd when you have people like that. There was a person who was constantly showing up for all of the police calls, and he was known. He was a known person that kept showing up. And what ended up happening was you had multiple police agencies on scene because it happened a block away from the Long Island Railroad. So not only did you have the county police there, but you also had the MTA police, the Metropolitan Transit Authority was there as well. Well, one agency didn't know what the other agency was doing. There were plainclothes officers also on scene with their badges around their neck, but they also had firearms, long guns with them. And somebody in the, I don't know if it was, the cop, somebody there yelled gun. The off-duty officer ended up being shot and he passed away from his gunshot wound injury. The radio traffic that happened afterwards is things of nightmares. What you'd listen to, again, I was at home listening to this unfold, jaw dropping, listening to the panic that set in immediately after, the injury to the officer. But I think that one specific event that happened here basically was the reason that encryption took hold of the county. Again, there could be some bad actors out there. When you look at some of the protests that had happened in recent years, you would have people who listened to scanners and knew where police were showing up or going to be setting up barricades or checkpoints, and were redirecting people based off of what they were hearing off the scanner. And again, if somebody had eyes and ears on just where the police were to begin with, they could have easily have set up checkpoints in the agency or in the town or wherever it was that they were planning on protesting anyway to see where the cops were. And they could have done, there's always ways around it. I don't think scanner radios are the reason that specifically things happen. I think when you take something away, people learn, they know how to adapt to the challenges at hand. So if you take that away from them, they will just find another way to get the same information and share the same information. It's just at this time, scanning makes it convenient, is the convenient way of doing it.
And social media now too. Yeah,
exactly.
I guess now is a good time to talk about encryption.
Yep.
And there's lots of different viewpoints on this. And, I know in your position, you probably have to be, you have different masters that you have to be considerate of, because I know you work with a lot of public safety people and they can make some very strong arguments for encryption. But then there are also the other side where they can make strong arguments against. What are your thoughts about encryption and why is it happening?
So let's look at part of your question first when it comes to just public safety, right? The arguments within public safety against encryption. It has happened again in my county. Not to say my county is bad, but I think every place has its little bits, right? That it's not so great. Definitely out of character for the location I'm about to tell a story in, but my local police have encrypted. And the fire departments they were in an uproar. We can't listen. We have no idea what is happening in our own backyards. We always get a jump on rescue calls because we know there's an accident, because we heard the accident come over the police scanner, and it takes 7 to 10 minutes for our own dispatchers to get notified because of just all the red tape and everything else that happens here, that we could already be, casually showing up en route. And then when we get to dispatch, lights and sirens, right? We can cut time off by doing this. And the police department basically said, well, we'll give each dispatch place, whether it be county dispatch or each independent dispatcher, two radios, one is staying at dispatch center and one that could go to a chief or a higher up or just an area that the general people can listen to, right? So each chief is like, well, there's like 4 chiefs here, or there's 2 chiefs and 2 assistant chiefs. So it really did trickle down to this. Well, this is the best you're going to get. You're only going to get 2 radios. And that's that. We're not giving any more away. And then it became a big problem where somebody got their hands on a radio and they cloned the radio. So then that became a problem. There are departments that have gotten smart to it, and they take their one dispatch radio and they pump it through the in-house intercom system. So anybody in the firehouse can hear the dispatcher's police issued radio, which is great. So, but to go to the story here. So there was an issue where there was a shooting and the local EMS company was dispatched to the scene of the shooting. They roll in not knowing it is still an active shooter situation and are now taking on fire when they showed up at scene. That became a big argument that, hey, we need to know what is happening. The county still took their position and said, you got your 2 radios, make sure you use them wisely. So that became a whole big issue. So within public safety, that is the argument against encryption. From my position here, I have to be respectful of both sides of the story. As a scanner radio listener, I don't like encryption because I can't hear what I want to hear. But in the meantime, too, I had to take the stance in saying, well, if I was ever in an accident or if I'm getting pulled over by a police officer, do I really want my name, my date of birth, my address, my social security number, and all other personal information to go out over a clear channel? Do I want somebody else to know everything about me based off of a traffic stop? Do I want somebody knowing that I'm at a traffic stop, right? To me, that's personal information and that I don't want somebody knowing. I get it. Encrypt that information because I really don't want that. It's like walking around with that guy from LifeLock that was giving his social security number out to everybody, right? What happened to the guy? Everybody tried to steal his social security number. So there is that part there. My thought really is there should be a clear channel for day-to-day dispatching, right? As and I think it's too political here, but there's people who will say, I pay your taxes. It's a community thing. It's transparency, this or whatever it ends up becoming. Dispatch should be in the clear. If you have a tactical situation, if you have something that's sensitive, if you have something that's officer safety, if you have an active shooter situation, protest, whatever it is, if they have to take that over to a secure channel, take it to a secure channel. Secure channels can be abused. I mean, it's happened before where officers, and not to put people in the light, but it has been published in the news that, they talk about this or they discuss that over what they presumed to have been a secure channel that wasn't a secure channel. And it comes out that they talk negatively about a particular person or a bunch of people or whatever it happens to be. So there's oversight committees that think that we should be able to hear everything, that nothing should be encrypted. So again, my stance is I believe that we should be able to listen to what's over the airwaves because that's what makes the hobby fun, right? It's fun to listen to what's going on. My local police department, yes, is encrypted. There is definitely an issue with me not being able to hear them, but you have to learn what else you can listen to work around the problem. Well, I listen to the MTA, the railroads, because if a train derails, I'll hear about it there as opposed to hearing about it on the local police channels. But there's also things you won't ever hear about. So there's that line. Personal line, no encryption on dispatch channels. And there are departments out there that do that. There's actually one department out in California that just said, we're going to turn off encryption this week. They made a big statement that said, hey, as of this date now, our residents can now listen to police dispatches again. And it was a big PR thing. And I wish that more places would do that. There's an old saying that says what's good for California is good for the rest of the country. I don't agree with that statement because of a lot of things that happen in California I'm not for, but this happens to be one of those things that I really wish would happen where we are. But again, there's officer safety. Again, there was something that we just talked about before in my county in a town that's close to me where an officer passed away because of scanner radio listeners. Again, do you need to have an active shooter situation? Do you need to have traffic stops? Do you need to have all these things in the clear? There has to be a fine line where it comes to public knowledge versus officer safety and security versus also high profile or high, maybe there's a person of authority or of power or political connection, whatever it might be, a person of interest. Certain things, again, don't need to be available to the active listener.
One of the things I hear a lot from scanner listeners is that open channels encourage accountability. If people are listening, officers may not do things they would do knowing that they're not being listened to. Do you think that's true?
It's a good question that I'm going to be very careful to answer because, again, I don't want to insult anybody or kind of paint myself into a corner with this kind of response, because I do understand and respect the whole reason for this. I think, again, human nature, that there are people that will try no matter what to, they're gonna do something wrong anyway. I'm not saying it's just specific to a particular group or to a department or a job function or something like that, right? I believe that for the most part, people are good people, but it always does take one or two bad seeds to ruin the reputation for everybody. So it doesn't matter if 99 people out of 100 are angels. It's that one person out there that is going to spoil that reputation for everybody. So if there's one or two bad cops in the pool, yes, that's what people are going to say that everybody is like, because that's the example that gets made examples of. But yeah, going back to what we were talking about earlier, where there were some examples where people were saying things and doing things that they thought were on a secure channel that weren't. That was the whole deal with the mobile data terminals. And that's kind of what got Bill Cheek in trouble a while back, was he was selling kits that would allow you to demodulate digital or computer traffic that was over the air. And he wasn't basically selling the software that would allow you to listen to the mobile data terminal, but you could acquire the software to listen to the mobile data terminal or to decode the mobile data terminal by using his kit as the go-between your computer and, I mean, there was 1,000 other things you could have used that kit for, but one of them was to listen to the mobile data terminal. And it turned out that it was sold to them as being secure, but the whole thing of it being secure was the fact that nobody had the technology at that time to listen or put back together the zeros and ones. And people were saying things they shouldn't have been saying over that because they thought it was secure. The other thing is that, well, you always have the right to file a FOIL request, right? Freedom of information. But a lot of departments will drag their feet over that, or will say that that's sensitive or redacted, or,
under investigation currently.
Right. Or we can't just give you between the hours of 12 midnight and 11:59 p.m. for every single day as a FOIL request. It has to be that specific time and date and everything else that's required to it, and maybe we'll get it to you. So this is a whole lot that gets, and it does get political and everything else that comes out of it.
It sure does. I want to talk to you about just a side question here. Mm-hmm. I'm having trouble finding women to interview, and people of color as well, because I've got a lot of white men, mm-hmm. but I know there's more in the hobby. I know there are lots of women, and I know there are people of color who listen, and I would love to find more. Okay. Are there any groups of women or groups that you mentioned, and you may have just made that up, about mom scanner groups? Are there any of those that you know of, or any? I would love to find some women who listen to scanners.
I can put you in touch with somebody if you'd like to. I know somebody who's in the Midwest. I think she's in Ohio, but she does like listening to the scanner. She's actually a member of my community that we have over on Discord, and she comes in. I do a live, like a monthly meetup. We come into Zoom and we talk, and she's present for those. So if you would like her information, I can certainly pass her information over to you.
I'd be grateful if you could shoot that to me. That would be
let
terrific.
Me ask her if she's okay with that first, and then,
of course,
and then when I got her permission, or I could just, if you want, I can just send her your information to reach out. But she's definitely into the hobby. But I think radio in general is kind of a man's hobby. I think it goes against race, but I think it definitely goes against sex. That we're kind of the guys who will find us. But it's not to say it's not unheard of. There's a plenty of amateur, there's XYL groups or YL groups for young ladies, or but there are certain industries and hobbies that lean definitely one way or the other. As far as race goes, I think that this is definitely a hobby that is not race specific. But
I agree. I mean, it might have been 40 years ago, just because there weren't as many people of color exposed to it. But now I think it's, that's my thought.
There might be somebody else too that I could reach out to also.
Beautiful. I really appreciate that. And I have one kind of last question, and that is, in journalism, we like to talk about war stories, big stories that we've covered, big stories we've been involved with. Do you have any scanner war stories of a big event that you listened to or participated in terms of sharing information or not, but anything that stands out in your career of scanner listening?
Yeah, there's a couple, like the one we talked about earlier about the officer being shot here, but there's another one that was newsworthy that I listened to happen live, and only by mistake, because it wasn't something I typically scan. It was just something that I just happened to have on, and I caught it by accident. And yeah, I do have the audio. It's archived here locally, but I haven't shared it with anybody as far as the audio goes, because it's just one of those chilling things. After the air show wrapped up here on Long Island, the air show happens every year, Memorial Day weekend, and it brings in a bunch of military craft. It brings in a bunch of civilian performers, and it brings in a lot of old antique types of planes. But not only do they fly for the air show here and do a performance or just a flyby, but sometimes they'll fly out to the Statue of Liberty and do a pass while they're in town, or they'll fly up the Hudson River. And it's a big weekend here. In fact, the Sky Typers, at the time they were Geico's Sky Typers, but I think they've lost the Geico name recently. But they would fly out every Memorial Day and drop a wreath at the Statue of Liberty, right? So certain little things that happen here and there. But there was a couple of planes that were in old, I think they were the P-51s, I think, that were in, if I'm not mistaken. And I happened to have the radio going on aviation because the air show was in town. And I was just generally listening to the general aviation frequencies, nothing spectacular. It was 123.45, 123.4, just a typical air-to-air communication between pilots. And it's routine conversation I'm listening to. And all of a sudden, one of the planes loses power and goes down. And you don't hear anything come over the pilot that had the issue, but you do hear the panic of the other pilots he was flying with. What happened? Where did you go? Are you in trouble? The pilot went down in the water and passed away. So that was something that, I was not expecting to hear, but, we were able to hear over the radio. So that's one of those war stories. But the big war story is 9/11, being that I am an hour away from New York City, more or less, Manhattan, closer to the actual border of physical New York City. But we always think of New York City as being the actual island of Manhattan. And yeah, I didn't listen to it live, but I do have copies of all the tapes. I've got copies. It's weird listening to it because they come on the air, or they come on to the tape and say, this is recording number XYZ from the FDNY archives, tape 1, side A. And then you hear the retransmissions of the day. I still can't make it more than a couple minutes listening to those tapes. But as a memorial to 9/11, and I don't know people, I don't think personally, that have passed away through 9/11, but I know people who know people, or I know people who lost family, or I know people who family was first responders and passed away. Know people who are still losing people due to cancers and everything else. But there are scanner radio listeners out there that like to listen to 9/11 again. And to them, I don't know if it brings closure to it, or maybe it brings a little bit of excitement. Maybe it brings a little bit of just remembering that day. It's what they do. But I rebroadcast those tapes in real time to the internet. And there are a lot of people who log in and listen to the audio from Manhattan on my 9/11 tapes. They're not my personal tapes. I found them on the internet, and I actually forget the organization who publicly shared the tapes. I do not claim ownership of them or whatever, but I rebroadcast. Basically, I just stream them out in real time. And so many people have listened to it that I actually had to get hosting through Amazon's web services, because every time I would broadcast them here, it would crash my local server. So I end up now relaying the traffic over to there. But that is a huge war story, basically, because it did lead into a whole war. But you hear everything. I mean, you hear routine traffic, you hear the initial dispatch for the Trade Center fire, you hear the chaos of dispatchers trying to tell units in the field to not talk over each other or to take turns, or, you know, you can hear everybody keying up on top of each other. You can hear people screaming for help. I mean, the nightmare that what happened over the air. It certainly painted a picture of the failed infrastructure, right? Because at that point, it was a conventional repeater. It was a field or receive side, a transmit side, even though there was a mixer in the way. But yeah, the system couldn't handle it. You can't have all these people keying up, asking for help, or where do I respond to? And those poor dispatchers, they were able to keep a cool head and keep things organized and get information out. I mean, I can't imagine the chaos that was not only happening out in the field at the Trade Center, but, you know, in the command bureau. I mean, it's unbelievable. But yeah, it was not only FDNY, but you had NYPD, you had the EMS companies all in there. I mean, there was a lot of stuff. And I remember seeing the smoke from here where I am. The Long Island Expressway was empty. I have never seen it where you could walk down the expressway and there was just no cars out. I mean, the effect rippled, and it's, again, not just here in New York. I mean, you had the plane that went down, and was it Pennsylvania? I think it went down, and you had the Pentagon, and it wasn't, everybody kind of focuses, you know, here locally because it was the Trade Center, but a lot of stuff, you know, that happened because of that. But that's a war story.
Yeah, it sure is. And do you broadcast it on the anniversary, or do you just broadcast it all? Yeah,
it's on the anniversary.
Time?
So
on the anniversary.
Yeah, and it's in sync with the time too. So the actual feed kind of comes on early so that people can set up and listen to it. And then I think the first tape starts rolling. It's queued up so that there's enough dead air and an intro stuff, so that at 8:46 a.m. on 9/11, that's when the audio comes in. So
wow,
it's pretty much real time.
Now, do you run a little business here with the scanner thing, or is it just something you do on the side? Or
well, it is on the side. No matter how much of a business I try to make it, it's not a profitable thing to make a living off of. I think those who make livings off of scanners are very far and few. Yeah. It's not to say it's impossible to do, but I haven't been able to do it. But yeah, I started with a website. I think we come full circle here with this question here. So I had a website that I ran on my amateur radio call sign called w2lie.net. And I had live scanner radio feeds going there. I had frequency lists published. I had website forums, and I actually had a chat group that was set up on the side so that if somebody had something they wanted to send out right away, it would go out in the chat box. And eventually the chat box would buffer out and the old stuff wouldn't be visible anymore. But anything new and would always be on the front page. And it was a social media community about scanning here on Long Island. And my draw to it was that at the time when I launched the site back in 2005, nobody else had streaming scanners on the internet in my community. And it was very difficult to try and understand how to set up a scanner because there weren't a lot of people doing it at that time in the way that I wanted. Alpha tags were being sent out. We were recording audio, archiving it. And I was reached out by somebody, said, "Hey, I live up in the Bronx. I want my scanner program. Can you program a scanner for me?" And that was like, oh, I could start programming scanners. So I started charging $50 and up to program a radio. And not to say it was profitable, but when it was profitable at the time, because my expenses was really just the website and buying a couple of radios and the software and stuff like that. So I was doing pretty well as far as the side business goes. And then I ended up creating Monitor Long Island Inc. as an S Corp because I started selling scanners. And I've discovered profit margins were very tight when it came to that kind of hardware. And the S Corp now became the umbrella for everything else I do. So somebody reached out to me and said, hey, Phil, have you seen these pagers, these fire pagers that people carry? They hold 64 memory channels. You could actually use one as a scanner. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. So I actually now spun off another business called East Coast Pagers that I sell all these fire pages off of. And that's doing fairly well. But again, not so much enough that I can make a living off of. Side business, really good. Living, not so good. And then I created this podcast. And the podcast is a vampire that sucks all of the profits out of East Coast Pagers. and so yeah, if you look at it that way, the what I'm doing here at the scanner is kind of, is really a vampire. But in the end, the business was created so that I could fund my hobby without having really to ask my wife for permission to buy radios or antennas and stuff like that. Right. It funds all that. And I think now it's getting to a place that it could, I could really start putting money. I've been taking money out of it and investing it into stocks. What a great time to be investing in stocks. But it's getting to a point where, and it's not because of it's because of the hobby, but it's not because of the podcast or any one particular thing. And I think they all come together as a whole and are doing that. But yeah, I am able to siphon a little bit off the top and not make a living off of it, but maybe set up a retirement account or to pay for my daughter's tuition for school, or to maybe put money aside so I could save up for a vacation or expense. I'd love it to be full-time. I would love to be able to sit down and do this and create more content about the scanner radio hobby. Maybe in retirement, maybe 20 years from now in retirement, I could do that. But for right now,
I teach podcasting and I teach content creation, and I can tell you, you're pretty good. Just keep at it.
Yes.
That's the real key to success with podcasting, is doing it long enough, having a good idea and doing it long enough. That's a lot of it. It's a word of mouth type of thing. So keep at it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And if you ever want me to chat again, I'm always glad to do it. Or if there's anything I can do to help you, let me know.
I appreciate that.
You really have your act together, and you know your stuff, and you're very articulate and a good interviewer. And, I'm a real old guy, so I've been around a lot of different folks, and I was a news director in TV, and I think you're onto something. So
I appreciate
hang in
that.
there.
Thanks. I think that my problem is I've got too many balls in the air. I think between everything that's going on, I think if I could drop them all and focus on one, it would be a whole lot better. But the problem is I need to do this to fund this to do, they all kind of like live off. Like I said, it's a vampire. If this wasn't a vampire, I think everything else can be totally pushed aside. But yeah, I'm hoping one day this will be completely self-sufficient. And when that happens, then we'll be cooking with gas.
It's wonderful to meet you. Pleasure.
Same here. And thank you very much for reaching out. And I wish you great success with your study and your article. And we'd love to get a little peek of it once everything is all done, if you don't mind. Yeah,
I'll send it to you. I might send you some other stuff I found too that might interest you. So I really, again, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll talk again.
You got it. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care.
Hey, Brian, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to jump onto a recorded session and for a podcast. And I really want to wish you the best of luck with your research and with the publication of your paper. And of course, graduating and earning all the titles that come along with what it is you've been spending so many years working on. I really did enjoy our conversation, and I want to just say it one more time. The invite is there for you to come back on the podcast at any time. So I'd love to speak with you again. And again, the door is always open. Now, before we end today's podcast episode, as a general reminder, I'm always looking for questions to answer. And in fact, I've been answering more questions on YouTube. So make sure you check us out over there at scannerschool.com/YouTube. But you can also leave me your questions at 516-308-2885 or by using SpeakPipe or our voicemail link or over at scannerschool.com/ask. Please hit subscribe on this podcast episode, no matter where you're listening to it on. So if it's a podcast over on an audio player or over on YouTube, that would really help motivate me to keep going with the podcast episodes. And finally, we have our Discord server, which you can join us over at scannerschool.com/Discord and be a part of the Scan Nerds community. Before we wrap up this week's podcast, I want to take a minute here to thank all of our Patreon supporters. Alan Gonzalez, Arthur Altrak, Arthur Heron, Bill Kay, Bob Brops, Bob Milton, Brandon Sammons, Brian King, Chris Paris, Craig Harper, Dan, Dave Dombrowski, Dave Pasco, David C., David Kuzneski, Denny Crotty, Dylan Hyder, Ed Walsh, Edward Bramlett, Glenn Wright, Greg Johnson, Guy Lee, I Hate Junk Mail, Jack Haycock, Jacques Berry, James Broxson, James Felling, Jay Reed, Jeff Block, Jeff Chapman, Jeff McLeod, Jenny Taylor, Jim B., Jim Heinrich, Joe Curtis, Joe P., Joe Kordoff, John Keel, John Sheldon, John Sweeney, John Goldenberg, Joshua Robb, Ken Newberry, Kenneth Fowler, Kevin Zwicky, Lenny Bauer, Les Stevenson, Lloyd R., Mark Beebe, Michael Gorman, Michael Kroger, Michael Meadows, Mike Lopez, Mike Piltz, Nicholas Stenger, Paul Teal, Raymond Hill, Rich Palmieri, Ronnie Bach, Sal Marandola, Scott Lefgren, Terry Wright, Tim Mazza, TJ, Todd Glendy, and William Arcand. Find out more about Patreon and our support tiers by visiting scannerschool.com/Patreon. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you again next week. 73.